I'll tell you one thing for sure. This film sure is purty.
Everyone's waiting for you. Do you believe in ghosts?
And today we have Last Night in Soho. There's no comma. It's kind of like with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, you know that it's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But this, I don't know if Edgar Wright's trying to say Last Night in Soho or Last Night in Soho. Like, one's sinister, one is more of like a recollection. Maybe it's both. Who knows at this point. But for those of you that don't know, marketing for this one hasn't been as good as the marketing for Edgar Wright's last film. But Last Night in Soho came out just the other weekend this year. If you don't know who Edgar Wright is, that guy right there. Basically, like, I think that I have every one of his movies, at least every one of the mainstream movies, but he's the guy who brought you, I don't know, for the Americans out there, he's the one that brought us Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. And most recently of note, he brought us Baby Driver, which was his last film, which I think Baby Driver was marketed excellently, and everybody heard about Baby Driver, or most people did. Otherwise, if you know about who he was before all that, there's what's called the Cornetto trilogy, or Cornetta. It's a British like ice cream snack. But basically, his three films that really were his breakout films that really gained him his notoriety, and his notoriety as like a skillful and artistic and funny and stylistic director were Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and At World's End, which is in itself like not a chronological trilogy or even like the same universe, but just kind of the same actors ish, and then usually just the same style, different stories, but still either comedy, dark comedy, light survival horror, definitely very violent in all three cases. But those happened, and then we knew him for Scott Pilgrim, and then he brought us Baby Driver, and now we had the latest, Last Night in Soho, which I was actually pretty surprised by the trailers. As I'll get into in the actual review of the film, as well as prefacing this now, Last Night in Soho is a bit of a departure from the type of film that Edgar Wright normally does, but I'll get into that in a moment. So that's who he is. The main stars of the show, there is, as I always say, more to the cast, but the main ones of note, we have our leading lady, Thomasin McKenzie, who does a really good job playing kind of like soft-spoken, but with that passionate heart on the inside. But yeah, you might recognize her from my reviews, most notably. I don't know if I mentioned her, but she was an old. Poor gal got dragged into that. But I think of more note and what really shows her skill is she was also in Jojo Rabbit. And she had a very pivotal role in Jojo Rabbit, an emotional one, but also a crux to the main narrative. I think that, I don't know if you would call that her breakout role, because she's been, again, like a lot of the actors that I always talk about, there is a larger filmography aside from just these that I mentioned, but these are the more mainstream works, like between Old and Jojo Rabbit, like one that you would probably know from hearing about it, and one that you would hopefully know because it was a great film. My still biggest crush, I swear to God, I got a few of them in Hollywood, but Anya Taylor-Joy, also in this film, as always, also kills it. And I like the parallel here. You can tell in the trailer you have like one is kind of a fantasy version of the other, and one is more reserved. I mean, you get it. It's like the Prince and the Pauper, basically, but very dreamlike in this film. But I'll get into that in a bit. And then the other, I guess, lead. I mean, like I said, there's other leads, but his face is the third largest on the poster, is Matt Smith. And he's popping up here more and more in American film. Well, I mean, this isn't really an American film, but if you know him from anywhere, if any of you out there are pop culture aficionados, he was Doctor Who at one point in time. So he's not the current Doctor. Not really my favorite, but I respect what he put out there. All three of these people are more or less the leading cast in this. They all do a good job. Honestly, all performances in this film, great. No complaints. Performances are great. Sometimes they get emotional. I get into it. I buy the humor, the fear, the in awe, like everything's emoted properly. So bravo. As you can probably tell by the thumbnail, like I really enjoyed the film. I hate to side with critics on this one. It might be my least favorite Edgar Wright film. Not to say that I didn't still really enjoy it. I think I still enjoyed Baby Driver more overall, but no, this was still really good. Like I said, a bit of a departure from kind of what Edgar Wright normally does. His stuff is typically, like I say, grounded in the sense of like it's very much we're getting point A to point B, probably some twists and turns along the way, always something unique about his films, a visual aesthetic, very stylized, excellently shot, shots are well composed, there's always a bunch of hidden shit in a lot of frames and whatnot. And I was looking for hidden stuff, but I think all the hidden stuff in this film, it wasn't so much about subterfuge. I mean, there were still like twists and turns along the way, but I didn't feel like I would have seen or discovered more upon a second or third viewing, you know? It's weird because if you look this film up online, it's under horror or like a horror thriller. There are most certainly horror elements to this film. It gets a little bit spooky, and there's definitely horrible things that happen, but I would not go as far as to say horror. Maybe psychological horror, but I got more of like thriller vibes. I'd be quicker to say it's a psychological thriller, but you could make an argument to convince me that it's a psychological horror, and I would discuss. I don't think I'd put up too much of a fight, but it was surprising to see it listed as horror online is what I'm trying to say. Going through it, I love the visual aesthetic of this film. It's one of those things that during the day it's very much like modern, plain. Here's London. Here's where it takes place mostly in Soho. At night, we are then transported to probably the better parts visually of the film. These basically like neon-soaked London streets of like 1960s Soho. That aesthetic's really cool, and it's funny because the main character's like, if I can go anywhere, I'd love to be back in 1960s London. And like, I would be hard pressed to disagree. I've always said I was born in the wrong time. Granted, not that I'm a fan of the rampant racism and sexism that was even more prevalent back then, because it's still prevalent now, but it's that aesthetic of like suits, gin and tonic, and going to the bar and seeing the new stars in the shows and all that. Like, I get it, like the 60s, 50s, like, I don't know, people took more pride in how they dressed and their demeanor for the most part, but I digress. The most unique aspect of this film, and it's hard to describe, I think, again, I allude to it in the title of the video, the film is a bit of like, visually it's very stimulating. There's a lot of very, very, very well done visuals. The shots are composed brilliantly, direction is outstanding, excellent job in the camera work department, and just visually, it's great. The effects, whether they're visual or whether they're practical, like all of it, the shots are all really cool. But then from like from an auditory standpoint, sound design, I mean, like characters, audio, music, singing, sound design, it was overwhelming, but not in a negative sense, if that makes any sense. Like, it really helped put me in the shoes of our main character or characters whenever the audio, like the mixed audio, I mean, it could be like, it felt like 5 to 10 different layers of audio in some scenes, and it's supposed to disorient you and kind of make you feel like, whoa, there's a lot going on, sensory input overload, but it never felt too much. Now, for some other people, I'm sure plenty would disagree and they would not enjoy it at all, but for me, it added to my enrapturement, if that's a word. Like, I was definitely enraptured more into the film. I was able to sink more into the characters and the experience of it whenever these sequences got all dreamlike and visual and fantastical, and the audio kicked in, and there's just like all this swimming around, not even swimming around in your head, but you feel like you're swimming around in the film, but in a positive sense. Again, it's hard to nail into words, but if you watch the film, you might kind of get a grasp on what I'm talking about. What I do like about it as well, since it does, while on one hand it does feel like a departure from what he normally does, I like how it feels like Edgar Wright as a filmmaker is trying to expand his filmography. Like, he's done comedies, he's done horror comedy, he's done action, he's done like action comedy, he's done now a little bit of psychological thriller and horror. Like, I like to see a talented director branch off and like still, like, you can still tell like this has his his mark on the film and how it's been done, but at the same time, like, while still having his flair, it's him trying something new. It's him trying to, like, you know, not reinvent anything, mind you, but trying to broaden his filmography and the spectrum of his brush, if you will. Like, he's trying to do more. What I'm saying is, if he continues to expand his style and do multiple different genres of film or different types of film, I'm here for it, because I still see the talent behind it. I still see him creating good films, at the very baseline good films, and I like to see him kind of like experimenting more and trying out different styles of film. So I think the only cons that I have, and this is what starts to kind of take themes away, I know a lot of critics say the movie falls apart in the third act. I would disagree. However, I would say I think the film still stands as a whole film. Perhaps some mild pacing issues, but the biggest thing for me, and I'm not going to spoil, like, again, what happens in the film, but there's some things that our main character says and does, especially in the end, like end of the second act, like definitely in the third act, but there's some things that she says and does that seem like they'd be irrevocable, like they'd be irreversible, that you wouldn't be able to, like, they seem like they would have a very lasting effect on what happens to her in the rest of the movie, and yet somehow by the end of the movie, some of that is just resolved and almost swept under the rug. And, like, not to say that everything is absolved, like, you have to kind of put a part of your brain that demands logic and sense kind of on the shelf a little bit, because some of these presents are wrapped up under the Christmas tree and ready to go, you know, to be unwrapped in the morning, but some of these, the bows are a little bit loose, and some didn't have bows at all. I'm making a very complicated Christmas metaphor here, but what I'm saying is, it could have been cleaner. I'm surprised too, because typically Edgar Wright usually has everything, like, not only is the script and the story typically airtight in his films, but enough so where there's able to be more layers and contextualization, and there's more hidden narrative under, like, the more you dig, the more you find. And with this, it was pretty cut and dry, surprisingly. Again, no, I'm not still twisty and turny, but overall, compared to his other films, pretty cut and dry, and even some gaps in logic here and there, which are very surprising. So there's an ability our main character has in this movie as well. I'm not going to get too much into it. It's never 100% expounded upon. It's just kind of like a, well, not, I shouldn't even say ability. Well, you can call it an ability. It's like, call it a mental quirk, but it's a thing. And it's acknowledged but never delved into. And I guess on one hand, you can make an argument and say that you don't need to be spoon-fed, like, what exactly the mental quirk is. But at the same time, I wouldn't have minded learning a little bit more about it. And in doing so, I feel like that would have endeared me more so to our main character here. The only thing I can say is that there was a character or two here that I would have liked to have seen, not even necessarily more development, but at least, like, learned more about them, or had more of saw more of an arc with their story and their characters. I feel like, you know, everybody served the purpose in the narrative, but I don't know, I felt like some characters could have been explored a little bit more, and it could have happened, seeing as how this was almost a 2-hour film. And the last thing I would have to say is, like, there's a couple characters here and there, which I guess part of it is you kind of have to fill out those cliches, but it still kind of seemed cliche, you know, like, you don't always have to right inside the box, but they do for some of these characters, and it's like, it's okay. It's not immersion breaking. It's just noticeable a little bit here and there. But overall, I mean, yeah, I really enjoyed Last Night in Soho. I'll definitely buy it, add it to my Edgar Wright collection, because I think I have all of his movies, and I'll definitely watch it again, probably show it to friends and whatnot. Do I think it's his best work? No. Do I think it's his worst work? Hard to say. Again, it's not really like, that's kind of an unfair statement to make, but I do think he was really good. Could have been better, though. And to say that about an Edgar Wright film is kind of surprising to me, but yeah, it could have been a better film overall. But visually and from an auditory perspective, and the characters and the performances given are all stellar, and for that reason alone, I would check it out. And overall, I would have to give it, maybe I'm a little bit biased here, but I would have to give it Last Night in Soho a low 4 out of 5. It was a pretty great film. I thought it was pretty great. I enjoyed it, and I would say go see it in theaters. I'd say it's worth a watch. I mean, whether you're a fan of, like, again, I know it's classified as horror, and there are horror elements to it. It is technically rated R, but I wouldn't go that far. Psychological thriller, psychological horror at the most, I would say. But it's worth a watch. I thought it was really good, and I'm very excited to see whatever Edgar Wright does next. In the meantime, thank you guys and gals so much for watching. As always, it's been another review of another film. With I'm sure plenty more to go. We got 2 more months in the year before I try to put together a top 5 or a top 10 list. So let's see if I can actually do one this year. It's been a minute. But thank you guys and gals so much for watching. And as always, stay tuned for the next episode of whatever movie I review. Goodbye, travelers. Thank you.